Welcome back, Leggari Nation. On today's video, we're showing you a beautiful Leggari Stone Countertop Kit application. If you have old Formica, concrete, or wood countertops, you could install our countertop kit directly over it. Check out how beautiful these countertops turned out, and check the description below for more info on our kits.
So before we start priming, I'm going to go over everything that was done to prep these countertops for our countertop kit. We'll start with the edges because they're theoretically the most important part, because if you don't do your edges right, you run the risk of the material not flowing over good and the tape pulling off the primer. So the biggest thing on your edges, you want to round your corners. These were square, so you want to make sure you round your edges. These were routed, a small router bit. You can sand the Formica round too with like 80 grit and a palm sander. So these have been routed. We've also sanded the underneath a little bit to minimize the lip that'll catch on a square edge. So we've sanded the bottom edge, routed the top, and then once you're all done sanding, you want to make sure this edge is perfectly clean, because what'll happen is if this has dust or debris on this, once we tape over the primer, if that primer has a barrier breaker, which could be dust or debris, it can pull the primer off with the tape. So always clean your edges really good. The next thing that was done, there was a gap back here. They removed the backsplash. They're going to do a new backsplash. The back edge was caulked with a paintable caulking, so we don't want to just lose resin back there. So the best way to do it, instead of doing Bondo or something where you have to sand, just run a bead of caulking, make sure it's paintable latex caulking. Our primers will bond to that really good, and just try to flatten it off so you don't have a lip or a thick edge of caulking back there. So we did that to minimize any resin falling back there. And then the plastic, obviously you want to plastic everything off. Floors, cabinets, we like to use thick plastic on the floor, and then painter's plastic on the cabinets. Make sure you don't have any rips in it. And then the last thing, sand at the top of the counter. Some Formicas don't sand very well, so if you run into that, don't worry about it. Just do a good denatured alcohol wipe with a rag. Clean your counters, because we want to get all the contaminations, any oils from your hands on there. We want to get that off, so the denatured alcohol will do that. And then the last thing, they had a chip over here in the Formica. The Formica is stuck really good, so we're not worried about that, but we filled this with Bondo and then sanded it smooth. And then if you guys do have Formica that's peeling, if you have a small area, you can use Gorilla Glue. Like say this corner right here was peeling up or it was loose, you could put some Gorilla Glue underneath there, put a clamp on it, let that dry, and that's gonna be fine. If you have larger areas that are peeling up, just rip the whole sheet off, and then you can prime over the wood, because our epoxy kits can go over any surface, any hard surface. So that's kind of what happened for the prep wise, and then we'll go into primer now. So for the primer, we're just using a 3/8 snap roller. Make sure you guys are de-shedding those rollers so you're getting any loose hairs off of them. And then just a standard 6-inch roller tray. I always like to roll down the middle and then cross roll it out. This primer is designed to go on thin, and it'll chemically bond to smooth surfaces. And that's why we highly recommend priming with our WB primer. The stuff is a fast cure primer and designed to chemically bond to any smooth surface. So since we're doing our stone kit process, the technique requires us to tape our edges, right? We're basically creating a dam because we're putting the resin on so thick to where we don't have to touch it. We let it level out, and we want to create a dam so when this sets up, we can pull the tape and it doesn't wind up flowing off and pulling the design off. We want to keep that design the same. So this is kind of the process. We do 2 rows of yellow painter's tape, And after you guys are done, make sure you really press these sides down good to get a good seal. I always pinch the corners here. That kind of adds a little tension to the tape. And on these edges might be these corners right here might be an issue. The tape's obviously not very strong there. So an easy way to fix that is we'll just run a piece of tape when we're done if we need to kind of firm these up on these sides. This spot here is a little bit more rigid, so I think we'll be fine. But we'll kind of watch that and address that. But yeah, the biggest thing, let the primer set up for about an hour. And it's tacky right now, it's really tacky. The primer will set up underneath that tape, and we've never really had an issue with this tape. It's really sticky pulling the primer off. As long as your edges are clean and prepped right, this tape's not gonna pull our primer off because it's gonna wind up drying underneath the primer as we're doing the epoxy coat. So these are basically ready to apply the epoxy, so we'll go over the mixing process next. You can get all these items off our single items on our website. So you can go to leggari.com and you can purchase all of these. I'll kind of go through the products we're gonna use. So right here we have our 3-gallon metallic epoxy kit. That product is clear, and then you can add our metallics or our universal pigments. We're gonna be using our Leggari effects in brown. And then we have 3 of our universal pigments right here, pre-measured out, ready to go. And I'll kind of go over that process here for you guys just so you know. So that's the material. Supplies we're gonna need: 2 5-gallon buckets. For the stone kit process, we're gonna need 3 5-quart containers and then 6 2.5-quart containers. And this is for a 50 square foot counter. Obviously you'll need your primer as well. You can go on the single items place and get your countertop primer, which we did brown on this kitchen since we're doing brown universal pigments. So these universal pigments are awesome. We mix up the resin, add the universal pigment, blend that in, and it's ready to go. And it calls for, we do 5% of whatever epoxy you're making. So if you're making 1.5 gallons, you need 5% of that for the pigment. So we got a 3-gallon kit here. So 192, that's 1.5 gallons. We're gonna times that by 2. 384 ounces are in a 3-gallon kit. So we need to break that down because we're gonna do 3 colors. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna divide that by 3. So we're gonna make basically 1 gallon of each color. And so to figure out how many ounces of our universal pigment to add to this, I'm just gonna minus 5%. Hit the 5 button. So I need 6.4 ounces to pigment 1 gallon of our metallic epoxy using our universal resin. So it's really simple to figure it out. Say you're doing 64 ounces. You're making 64 ounces of resin. All you do to find out how much universal pigment you need to add to that is minus 5%. I need to make 3.2 ounces and add that to the 64 ounces of resin. So very simple, very cool pigments, and they just give you different looks than you would get with the metallic. So first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna mix up the resin because we mix it up clear, and then when it's all mixed, we dump 5% of our universal pigment in there. So I'm gonna start letting the part A drain out. And this process calls for about 8 ounces of epoxy per square foot to be able to coat your counters without having to really touch it and move it around. Our standard kits, they go down at 4 ounces per square foot. When you guys are doing this, make sure you're pouring the A's in and not, you don't want to pour like one of the A's and then one of the B's, because then you gotta kind of hurry up and mix this stuff up. So it'll take a second to drain out of the jug. I'll let most of it drain out, and then I'll kind of tilt it back to get the resin out of the handles. And then we're just gonna let that drain until it starts to slowly drip. So that's kind of what we're looking for, having it slowly drip. We can cap these. So for this counter, we don't want to stick around and wait for the material to set up as long as you typically would. So we're gonna manipulate this resin, and we always tell you guys never to do this. But if you're an experienced installer with epoxies, you can manipulate the resin, let it sit in a bucket and kind of heat up, and then dump it out, and that's gonna make the project go a lot faster. Your edges can be done sooner. You don't have to wait as long for drips. But again, I want to reiterate, if you're an experienced installer, it's It's okay to try this if you guys are new, starting out with the resin industry. Typically don't do this because you really need to know, have experience with using the resin and knowing how long it can sit in a container before you dump it out. So again, we're just doing this for time's sake purposes. We want to get these edges done quick and not have to wait around. And I also have I bring a temp gun, so I'll kind of go over what I'm looking at for letting this set up in the bucket. And it's just going to make the project go a lot faster. But again, guys, don't do this if this is your first time. The biggest thing is to mix the resin, get it dumped out, because last thing you want to do is let it sit in a bucket too long and it heat up on you, and then it's wasted, right? Because it'll heat up, get rock hard, and you won't be able to use it. So again, experienced installers have used resin a lot. They know what the time frame is. You can manipulate the resin for whatever situation you want. So we're going to do that on this. So we're going to add the hardener now, which is the part B. So same thing with the hardener, guys. The part B, we want to tilt it back, let it come out of the handle, and then we want to let it drain. Now this is the part B is a lot more fluid, so it won't take as long to drain out. But again, we're looking for a slow drip. All right, so I'm going to show you the easiest way to mix resins where you never have a soft spot. Your resin is always going to get hard. You're never going to have an issue with it, and you can also dump the product upside down in a bucket, let everything drain out, and we call it 3P2. And what that means is we go up and down from the bottom of the bucket 3 times. We take this bucket, we pour it into a secondary mixing bucket, obviously a clean one, and then we go up and down 2 more times. Now that's going to ensure all the part A that's on the sides is mixed in and everything's thoroughly mixed where you don't have any soft spots. So we go down, I kind of spin at the bottom, then I come up slowly, spin at the top, and that's basically 1. So we're going to do that 3 times. All right, so that was 1. 2 more times. All right, so that was the 3 out of the 3P2. Now we're gonna spin it in the secondary container to get all the resin off. And then wherever I set my paddle, I'm gonna always set anything with epoxy on it out there. That way I don't make my area a mess. We're gonna take this, pour it into our secondary mixing container. And then we're gonna scrape the sides, scrape the bottom, get everything out of it. Again, scrape the bottom. We want to get as much out of it as we can. And you want to move quick, guys. You don't want to just kind of go at a slow pace. You want to move quick. We have the hardener in there. We're gonna manipulate this resin to make it set up faster, so we don't have to wait as long to pull the tape and have it drip. But typically you'd want to just move quick, dump it out of the bucket. And you guys might be a little more messy than this, but that is okay. So now this bucket is basically garbage, because what happens is we poured the part A in first. That gets part A on all the sides. And what guys will do is they'll dump their B in, they'll mix it, they'll maybe scrape the sides a little, then they'll go dump it out. Well, what happens is that part B that's on the part A that's all over the sides doesn't get mixed in all the way sometimes, and it'll drain out. And then you'll have spots on your floor or countertop that are really sticky and tacky that'll never get hard. So this process ensures that'll never happen, and it's actually a fast way to mix. So now all I got to do is go up and down 2 more times, and this is ready to go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a cool Leggari tip how to keep your paddles clean. We just have a container of denatured alcohol. Obviously you don't want to spin this fast in here, so you want to go slow. I like to go forward and backwards. That'll clean off the resin, and then I'll take a rag and we'll just clean off the shaft here and then wipe this down, and this will be brand new every time you use it. It's a fast and simple way to keep your paddle wheels clean, because what happens if you don't, resin builds up, it becomes hard, you're using it, chunks will start to fall off and get in your mix. So we have a new paddle every time just by simply doing that. Put a lid on it and you can use that. I probably mixed down to that probably 20 times and we're still using that same half a gallon of material. And again, that's denatured alcohol. Again, remember we're doing 3 colors, so we need 64 ounces, or no, we need a gallon, which is 128 ounces of each color. So I'm gonna take this material and fill it up to the 128 ounce mark. All right, so I'm gonna check the temp right now. This resin's at 70 degrees. And so I'm gonna add the pigments, mix that in, and then we'll probably let these sit in these containers for about 10, maybe 15 minutes, but I'm gonna constantly check the temperature on it. If it gets to about 90 degrees, we'll start to dump it out. So it's at 70 now. We're looking for anywhere from 85 to 90 degrees, and then we're gonna dump it out. Pigment's already pre-measured. We needed 6.4 ounces of pigment, and that's what we have in these containers. All right, so now we have light, medium, and a dark brown. I want to start with the lightest one. I'm going to get a smaller mixing paddle on here. That way it's easier to clean. All right, so we're going to start with light and go to dark. That way I don't have to clean my paddle every time. So before I go to the other colors, I like to spin this out. Just get the majority of it off and then go to the other colors. All right, so what I'm gonna do, I don't recommend you guys doing this, but I'm gonna manipulate this resin. Typically you would wanna dump it into your dirty pour batches, right? Which I'll show you that when we're ready. But again, I don't recommend this, but we wanna speed up the amount of time we have to wait to pull the tape. So we're gonna manipulate the resin by letting it set up in here and kind of heat up before we use it. But again, I don't recommend you guys doing this. I've used this resin a lot. I'm really familiar with it, so I know how much time and that I have to work with it. So I'm gonna just kind of show you the temperature we have right now is 72 degrees. 71, 72, 72. So these are all about 71. When they hit about 80, 85, 90 degrees, we're gonna dump them out on the counter. So again, we only recommend that for people that have used resin a lot of times. So before you do your pour, obviously you want to do this before you mix. You can kind of map a design out to follow. That way when you're dumping stuff out, you don't really have to think about it. You can just follow your line, your pattern, and it's a simple way to take the guesswork out of it as you're pouring out. You can just dump it out a lot faster. I don't recommend doing this at home, but I just want to show you how versatile our products can be in different ways you can manipulate it. So when we stopped, it's been about 15 minutes. It was at like 74 degrees. They're now at 83 degrees. Now, obviously a larger mass of epoxy, like say we had this guy full, it wouldn't take, it would flash off faster. If you had it more in a 5-gallon bucket, that would flash off faster. But this amount right here, 64 ounces, it'll take this about 30 minutes to become unusable. It'll get to like 170, 190 degrees, and it'll just become rock hard. So it takes about 30 minutes for 64 ounces to do that. But we're just gonna wait until this gets at about 90 degrees or close to, and then we're gonna go start dumping it out. All right guys, so these are right about 90 degrees, 89. This one's 91, so we're gonna go dump these out. We wanna move quick, but again, don't recommend doing this at home. I've used this a lot, this resin a lot, so I know how to manipulate it and how much time I have. So we're gonna start dumping these out. And it's simple because I have these marks to follow. Now the biggest trick to doing these stone kits is we don't want to dump the same container out in the same spot. I want to jump around the counters. So Kyle's going to get in here, he's going to start dumping his out. And as I'm going through the container, I want to go to different spots on the counter. And I'm also taking note of what colors are coming out. Now I got these really cool lighter colors coming out. So what I'll do is follow one of these edges with that color. So when we get close to getting to our last buckets, we want to really start filling in these bigger spots, making sure we're getting product in those spots. All right, so our back edges can be kind of tough to get it to the wall. So these miss spots, I'm just gonna pat my finger in. I'll kind of run it out there. Any of these spots that need hit, push some resin back there and it'll level out. So all I'm doing now is just going around hitting any of these spots that aren't filled in all the way. That way the resin can level out. Some of these little stringies that we have kind of running across, it just doesn't look that natural. I'm just kind of patting them in randomly. And then if you see any spots, like this kind of looks like a little blob here, you kind of feather that out a little different. Same thing with right here, it's kind of weird shape here. Just any spots that you don't like, you can just kind of manipulate with your fingers, a squeegee. So once everything's hit, you don't have any spots where you can see the primer. We're gonna spritz it with isopropyl alcohol. So we're just small to medium drops, barely pulling the trigger. It'll create some really cool cells. All right, so we'll let that evaporate for about 10 minutes and then we're gonna mist it with denatured alcohol. So the last thing we like to do after the isopropyl evaporates is mist the counter with denatured alcohol. That's gonna help the surface just lay out glass smooth and get you that high gloss glass finish. So since I manipulated that resin by letting it set in a bucket, again, which I do not recommend, right? Don't try that at home, but we're able to pull this tape now basically probably within 5-10 minutes when, if you're mixing it and dumping it out right away, not letting resin sit in the bucket, this will sit there for maybe anywhere from an hour to 2 hours, depending on the temperature. So again, that speeds up the amount of time you have to wait. But again, you obviously need to know what you're doing to let the resin heat up like that. So you can see when I pull that tape back how it's moving a little quick, kind of flowing down. We want to let that set up just a little bit longer. So when I pull that tape down, and that's how I test the right time, it's moving down really slow. You can kind of see how it's moving a little fast. Now if you have a thick edge, you would probably want to pull it right now, right? Because you're going to need more material to flow over to coat that edge. Since these are small edges, we're going to let this sit for another 10 minutes and then probably pull the tape. We're looking for it to be slowly moving over like right here. You can kind of see how it's just slowly dripping down. Perfect time to pull the tape. If you pull it too soon and it's too fluid, it'll drag that design on the top all the way off the counter, right? Like this vein could wind up being on the edge here and you lose a lot of your design out here. So by doing this process, waiting, it's not gonna mess up the top design and it'll still flow over the edges, and that's why we do it such a thick pour on this process. Notice how it's not pulling any of the primer off on your edges. Once you get the tape pulled, you're gonna wanna rub in. So this is all surface tension here. And what's gonna happen if we don't brush that in or rub it in and slick it off with resin, it's gonna keep running down all these drip marks and it's not gonna wanna fill in these spots. So simply run your hand across it and don't worry about messing up the design because that's gonna run over the edge for another probably 20-30 minutes. If you just dump your resin out right away, it'll even run over a little bit longer because remember, we let that resin set up in the container before we poured it out. That's why we're able to pull the tape so fast and not have to wait an hour to pull that tape on the edge. We only waited about 10-15 minutes to pull the tape. And then you can see here, he's already brushed this in. You can see where he messed the design up, but it's already halfway down again. So all this will just roll over that edge and it'll make it look like it's cut out of a piece of stone. So the last thing you guys need to do before this sets up is just scrape the bottom drips. Very simple. And since we manipulated that resin by letting it sit in a bucket and heat up, it's already pretty sticky. And so I want to use a putty knife. When your resin starts to get sticky, you want to use something sharp, thin. Putty knife works great because what will happen is if you do a paint stick, it'll start to build up on that paint stick and it'll sometimes leave product on the back on that edge. So it's almost like you're cutting it off. We might have to do this again another 20 minutes, so it's good to periodically check it every 20-30 minutes. That way you don't have to sand any of these the next day. So that's how you do your drips. And then the last thing, don't assume your edges aren't gonna have any imperfections in it while it's flowing over. Always check your edges, and if you see any spots, you can simply touch them up with a paintbrush or your finger. I mean, these all look good, but say we had like a spot that looked like a run or a drip, I could just kind of feather that in with a brush or pat that in with my finger. Maybe there's a spot that cratered out, right? Separated, you could pat that in to help make that level out. All right guys, so we're finished up. It's probably been, I don't know, half an hour, 40 minutes. In this resin that's left over in the containers, it's at 156 degrees and it's kind of already clumping up in there. So that's what'll happen if you leave the resin in there too long, and in about another 5-10 minutes, this whole thing will be rock hard. But this is unusable. Look how it's all stringy. If you try to dump that out, it's not gonna do anything that you want.
Are you looking to remodel your kitchen without breaking the bank? Do you love the look of high-end stone or granite, but just can't stomach the price? Well, look no further than Leggari's Epoxy Countertop Kits. As the inventors of the first DIY epoxy countertop kit, our kits have quickly become the industry standard for beautiful, high-end epoxy countertops. In fact, Leggari Countertop Kits have been installed by thousands of DIYers and homeowners just like you all around the world. But don't take our word for it. Check out the hundreds of 5-star reviews from satisfied customers. Or order a sample kit today so you can try before you buy. Don't you think it's time for you to head over to Leggari.com to see just how easy it is to turn your dream kitchen into a reality?